Yeah,
Okay,
live.
great. Thank you. All right, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. It's nice to have everyone here today. My name is Lauren Hayes. I'm co-hosting the Fine Seminars, and today I'm host of we are our speaker today. So just a couple of brief announcements. Next week, we have Juan Carlos Reboreda from the University of Buenos Aires. And I believe his seminar will be on co-evolutionary arms races in birds. Just a reminder for people who are new to the Fine, the seminar goes about 45, 50 minutes, and then we follow it with about an hour, up to an hour of discussion. During that discussion, if you have questions, please put a question mark in the chat if you're in the Zoom room, and I will post those to the speaker today. If you're watching from YouTube, please put your questions in the comments and I'll relay those as well. As always, we try to encourage students, postdocs, etc., junior faculty to ask questions. So please, throw your question marks in there. It's a friendly crowd. We're all just interested in learning from each other. So hopefully people will throw their questions in there and I'll try to get them. I will definitely get them to the speaker. So this brings me to today's speaker, and that is Professor Jennifer Smith of Mills College in California, the United States. Jen is an associate professor at Mills College, as I said, and she has a really great background. She started out strong. She went to a small liberal arts college in Maine called Colby College, an excellent college, great science there, and great liberal arts programs. She did her master's at the University of Illinois, and then her PhD at Michigan State University. Her research is really quite fascinating, and you'll see, given her heavy teaching duties, she's really quite productive. She's interested in sort of the integrating evolutionary biology and animal behavior with more mechanistic thinking. And she takes that and tries to understand behavior in the context of urban ecology. So thinking of how selection and current conditions can shape behaviors in mammals. She's maintained a long-term study of the California ground squirrels, largely led work done by undergraduates. Her position at Mills College is primarily an undergraduate school. So she has a lot of undergraduates going in the field to learn field techniques and other relevant techniques, and she integrates genetic endocrine analyses into her work as well as social networks. So quite diverse in her approaches to understanding behavior. She's also been very active in comparative work, particularly in mammals and focusing primarily on carnivores. And her work really reveals, I think, the evolutionary ecological forces that influence leadership and cooperation. So hopefully we'll hear how that plays out here today. And I can speak from personal experience with Jen. We co-authored a book chapter together and was an excellent colleague on that project, did great work, and I think the end product was really nice. Jen's work is funded by National Science Foundation and various regional and university foundations. As I said, she's been quite productive despite having a pretty heavy teaching load. She has about 45 publications in really good journals like Journal of Animal Ecology, Trends in Cognitive Sciences, ProcB, BES, BE, and of course, Journal of Mammalogy. And she's received a number of awards regarding excellence in teaching and mentoring, including an Inspiring Programs in STEM Education Award that inspired for her work to be more inclusive in training STEM students. And she also received teaching and mentoring awards from the Animal Behavior Society and Phi Beta Kappa. So today, Jen is going to be talking about her work, I think, based on her title, Comparative Social Evolution in Mammals. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let Jen take over, and I hope you enjoy the seminar today. Thanks for being with us, Jen.
Great, thank you for the introduction. I think I'm all set up. Give me a thumbs up. Yep, great. So today I'm talking about comparative social evolution in mammals. And I will focus on a number of different questions, and with an aim towards fostering discussion after the presentation. I thought I would just start off by first thanking Lauren for that introduction, but also then giving an overview of the types of questions that I ask, and also what I've sort of done in the past to introduce myself before I get into our more recent work. So in general, oh, you're going. There we go. Okay. Switching back and forth between Zoom classes and now in person. So now we're going to get back to all of this. Great. So I asked questions about how do social interactions contribute to social structure, thinking about the ways that animals interact in repeated social interactions over time. I often do this in a social network context. I also ask, how do individuals contribute to collective decisions? And in particular, how is it that maybe one individual influences a group decision and has a disproportional influence on how the group behaves? I'm also interested in understanding whether individuals are consistent in their social interactions as they shift across different contexts. So when individuals are maybe foraging, engaged in a social interaction, how do the individual's reactions change, or are they consistent across time? And with an eye towards introducing myself to some folks that are less familiar with my work, I thought in the context of thinking about social evolution, I would mention that there's two general approaches for studying social evolution. And the first is basically to study social behaviors, and many have talked about these in previous FIND seminars, that have fitness consequences for individuals. In my previous work with spotted hyenas, I focused on these kin-biased coalitions where individuals, particularly adult females, go to bat for their genetic relatives, and they gain both indirect fitness benefits as well as direct fitness benefits for influencing the outcomes of these collective fights. I've also thought a lot about fission-fusion dynamics and the ways that spotted hyenas engage in time that is spent away from conspecific members of the group, or maybe meet up with them over various aspects of the day. And so they're like humans in a way where they can wander off by themselves, or they can come up and meet with conspecifics. And so I'm really interested in the degree to which this variation is driven by ecological context. So in this work, I looked at how prey abundance varied at different times of the year. And these black bars represent, on average, how there's a superabundance of prey during certain times of the year. And on this other axis here, we can see that there's tracking of social cohesion in response to how much prey are available, and food drives pretty much everything in the lives of these spotted hyenas. And that's been a general interest of mine. I then took this general pattern and placed it in a social network context, and I'll be focusing on social networks a lot throughout today's talk. And you can see here in this upper left-hand corner that each of these circles or nodes represents an individual, and the thickness of these lines reflects the degree to which they spend time together. So thicker lines means they associate more often, and we can track social interactions over time. We can see during periods of low prey abundance that kin are biased towards themselves, forming preferential social connections. The ties are generally fairly weak. And if we track these same individuals, the superabundance of prey coming into the Masai Mara in Kenya, where we study these, mainly Kay Holcamp at this point, and her team. But at this time, we're focused on how this reduced feeding competition and ties overall became stronger within these social networks. And of course, as the prey go away, the social network responds to this prey abundance being relatively scarce. So we started to think about the ways that these social interactions within a network context are not only stable, where kin are biasing preferences towards each other, but also how these give rise to ideas about social network dynamics. And so I was involved in this large collaborative effort to think about the ways that shifting from approaches where we might think of social networks as being fairly static to how they change across time and in response to food and other key environmental drivers. I also, in my previous work, have studied a second aspect of social evolution. So within the context of this seminar, we can study social behavior with fitness consequences within a species. We can also study within a comparative perspective, the general patterns that emerge across multiple species. And in this work, we focused on the mammalian order Carnivora, and we focused on a number of relevant social behaviors that also are presumably important for early hominin evolution as well. So these include things like cooperative hunting, intergroup coalitions, and thinking about what are the drivers or what co-evolves with cooperation in social carnivores. And this comparative analysis revealed a number of general patterns. And these include that as species have increases in brain sizes, we also see more cooperation, particularly with respect to hunting behavior. Cursorial hunting behavior co-evolves with cooperative hunting. And we also see as species start to shift towards a meat diet, we see more cooperation, and a reduction in sexual dimorphism across the carnivores is also correlated with an increase in alloparental care and cooperative breeding. So this is just a general overview of where I've been to introduce myself to this group. And feel free in the discussion period to return back to these themes. Today, I'll mainly focus on these exact two lines of inquiry, but I'll focus, as Lauren suggested, on my current long-term study, which involves studying these marked individuals of California ground squirrels. We paint fur dye on their backs, and we recognize them based on who they are and what marks we put on them. And we track these individuals across multiple contexts, both above and below ground. And we're interested in how consistent these patterns are. Well, also towards the end of the talk, I'll switch gears back towards that comparative lens and think about the evolutionary origins and diversity of social behavior. I'll focus on mammals and think about broad patterns with respect to collective action. So first, California ground squirrels. I'm coming from the Bay Area. You can probably see the squirrels behind me. I'm not in the field, but I love to be in the field. And when I'm there, I study these semi-fossorial, facultatively social rodents. I'm particularly interested in species that are incredibly flexible and are always making decisions about whether to be social or to spend time apart from one another. In addition, the ground squirrels are really dealing with a lot of predation risk, and they are coping with natural predators and human activity, and they have a number of defenses that they have co-evolved with natural predators, such as these rattlesnakes, sort of a textbook example of these California ground squirrels tail flagging and approaching rattlesnakes. They also deal with coyotes, birds of prey, and where I study them in the Bay Area, there are also humans that visit the site. So we're asking questions about individual differences with response to predation risk in that context, but also how they respond to human interactions. So here is the study site. When I go out, it's often a little bit drier than this, but it is absolutely beautiful with rolling hills in the San Francisco Bay Area in California. We have nearly a decade's worth of data on these marked individuals. And as I mentioned, we mark them with various marks, and we get quite creative and we can track them over time. And the first work that I will talk about is this idea that individuals often split their lives between multiple worlds or multiple ecological contexts. So for California ground squirrels, they are often above ground. And as humans, if we see them, that's where we might be most familiar with their social interactions. easy to study. We can get lots of information from that. But they actually, because they're semi-fossorial, they split their time between above ground and below ground interactions. So in this work, we're interested in tracking behavior across these two contexts. And I think this is particularly relevant I think whatever our situation is at the moment, we start to change our views of the research. And thinking about our own lives, and we're all on Zoom now, we're socially distancing and these kinds of things to varying extents. We split our lives between various contexts. Many non-human animals also split their lives between a context where individuals are relatively constrained and safe in a home, in a nest, up on a sleeping cliff. And then those same individuals go out into a second ecological context where life might be relatively open and free. And a lot of us are splitting our time between these different contexts these days in light of what's going on with COVID restrictions, et cetera. The ground squirrels also shift their lives. And for them, the shift is between social interactions. And when I talk about social interactions, I'll study these in a social network context. They're sometimes below ground, out of sight, but they're interacting there. And they're also above ground doing more conspicuous types of behaviors. So to what extent is what they're doing below ground correlated with what they're doing above ground? And moreover, within a particular context, are these behaviors consistent across time? Are some individuals particularly social and others less social, both within this constrained and relatively open context? As I mentioned, we study their social behavior, and squirrels engage in a number of interactions. They can do greeting behaviors, a nose to cheek or nose to nose, where they interact with each other. Young animals often play with each other. They can do a play slap or play wrestle. And then they also maintain social proximity with some individuals, but not others. So we can monitor these behaviors based on typical muddy boot biologist techniques. We go out with binoculars and we watch these interactions, and we can create social networks, which are shown here on the left. And these social networks are reflecting that above ground affiliative behavior. I don't have time to go into all of the details of the various tests that we performed, but in general, what we looked at here are different measures of social network, both direct and indirect measures of how social individuals are over time. And we were able to track individuals over time and establish that some animals are consistently social above ground in 1 year, and then those same animals through these consistency permutation tests are consistently social later in time. We also study their behavior below ground, but here we had to get a little bit more inventive. So here's one of my students collecting a squirrel, and as Laura mentioned, we also collect fecal samples, so I'm happy to talk about that in the discussion. I'm not going to go into their fecal glucocorticoid metabolites and how we measure stress in these animals or their microbiome, but I'm happy to go into that. Valeska has a squirrel here, and importantly for this talk, we not only do we put these fur marks on, but we implant each squirrel with a pit tag or like a microchip. I think most people in this room probably know that you put on your dog, but we call it a pit tag. And we can track a unique individual over time based on this electronic signature. And what we did here is we put these antenna loops, which are connected to a data logger in this RFID reader, essentially scans the squirrel every time they go in or out of the burrow. So take a box of cereal at the grocery store, you scan them. The same technology is applicable here, but this is happening when squirrels are going below ground in these relatively hidden spaces. So we then took the data, information about shared burrow use to understand, okay, are these squirrels fairly consistent in their social partners below ground at the level of a particular burrow entrance? And what we found is that these same individuals are fairly consistent and actually more consistent in their burrow use than in their above ground social interactions, but they're statistically significant in a variety of different measures. And so I wanted to know also, is there an interaction, or can we predict above ground sociality based on what's going on below ground? Are these two types of social networks correlated with each other? So in other words, if we build a below ground network with these same sets of individuals, are these same individuals preferentially interacting with each other in an above ground network? And in fact, they are. We did this for 1 year, we did it for another year, and we see this is consistent where the same individuals that are relatively social below ground tend to be social above ground. So overall, we see lots and lots of variation in sociality. It's consistent across time from 1 year to the next. We also see that some individuals tend to be loners, such as this little squirrel on the left, compared to the ones on the right that are relatively social, spending more time with members of their group. We're hoping to eventually connect this to the social network context, but I'll tell you briefly about what we're doing first with fleas. And so here we have, we've captured squirrels thousands of times. We know exactly who they are. We can capture the same squirrel over 6 years. And when we do that, the number of fleas that we collect from an individual are remarkably consistent. So some fleas are, some squirrels rather, have a high number of fleas. And there's variation here. That variation turns out is explained by ecological conditions that vary from year to year, but individuals across time have consistently high number of fleas or low number of fleas. And this is interesting in thinking about for this system in particular, because the fleas that the squirrels have can potentially harbor the bacterium that would pass on bubonic plague. So that our squirrels are healthy, we don't need to worry about that, but it's an interesting system for thinking about social network dynamics. And now that we understand how the fleas are being mediated by ecological situations, we're next going to go back to a social network approach and start to think about disease and parasite transmission across individuals, particularly below ground. Okay, so there are costs. A lot of us thinking about social behavior, we tend to think about costs and benefits. And of course, squirrels also experience some costs, maybe parasite transmission, disease dynamics, those things are important. Why do these squirrels come together? The main force that brings these squirrels together is predation risk. And so Chelsea Ortiz in her work has shown that group size during foraging is really important in structuring how vigilant individuals are. And as the group size gets larger, squirrels are more likely to allocate time to foraging rather than looking out for predators. In a more recent work, she's been asking, how do these individuals, okay, so in general, social group size matters and it reduces foraging risk. But what about individuality? So what happens if we do a typical flight initiation distance assay? It's called flight initiation distance because basically if she walks towards a squirrel, that squirrel will run away. And for a bird, they might fly away, but of course this squirrel is going to run away. We're able to measure the distance at which she's able to approach an individual. And we can actually think about the extent to which these individuals are consistent over time. Most folks stop at this level and only think about how close can I get to my subject and how responsive are they to that risk. What she's done, which I find really interesting, is she'll actually approach the squirrel and look at multiple phases of the anti-predator response. So for example, a squirrel makes several decisions, not only fleeing, but in addition, that individual may stop and look. They may, at a later point, resume their normal foraging behavior. They may alternatively show up to a shelter and then subsequently emerge from that shelter before resuming basic behaviors. And Eduardo, are you hearing me okay? Yeah. Okay, I just saw you on mute. Yeah. Perfect. And what we can look at then is not only this initial flight initiation distance response, but how repeatable each of these aspects of the multi-predator response are across time for particular individuals. She shows that they are remarkably repeatable across various aspects of the multi-predator response, or the multi-stage response of us as the predator approaching them. In addition, what she's finding is that this flight initiation distance is highly correlated with other aspects of the anti-predator response. So the distance that an individual moves before stopping and looking is correlated with their flight initiation distance. Also, it's correlated with, if they go into a burrow, the timing for the latency to emerge from a shelter. So this suggests that there's multiple things going on. An individual here is the most important aspect of this response. She also looks at environmental and social changing conditions, and they're actually not that important in shaping individual behavior. We took this, this work and thinking about this in a social network context, and this is sort of ongoing. We're building these really short-term social networks. So in the previous work, I showed you a network that is constructed over the course of a summer, a field season when both juveniles and adults are active above ground. And in this work, we're focused on 10-minute periods. So the individuals here are, in general, a lot less socially connected. The lines in this network refer to squirrels that are affiliating above ground. And what Chinny has been looking at is if these individuals experience a disturbance event. So in this network example, a dog off leash approaches the squirrels, and we're interested in how social networks change over time. So how do individuals respond in the 10 minutes before and the 10 minutes after they experience some type of disturbance? And she also looks at this in a variety of different contexts. So just setting the stage, we can talk about the details and the discussion, thinking about how it influences different aspects of behavior. I wanted to highlight two key findings from this work. So first is that these short-term changes in social behavior vary based on the disturbance type. So in particular, if these squirrels are out and they're interacting and they experience a human or a dog off leash or a human with a dog on leash, then this tends to disrupt their social network. So they tend to be less social in the minutes directly following that. And we just had a 1-minute period of disturbance and then 10 minutes of the reaction to that. Interestingly, if a coyote walks by, that actually promotes social cohesion. And we see a lot more increase of these individuals interacting when a coyote is out in the area, suggesting that that natural predator actually is promoting social interactions. I talked a lot about this individual consistency, and of course, we looked at that as well in this network context. And in general, adults are more consistent in their responses than our juveniles across multiple situations, multiple types of disturbance to their networks. We're also, this is work with Erin Person, who I believe is here, and she is working with Eileen Lacey over at UC Berkeley and myself on Team Squirrel, and she's asking some really interesting questions about these long-term social networks. So again, thinking about a social network within the context of a summer, and she's interested in understanding how individuals locate food and resources within an environment. She puts out these antenna loops. These are similar to the small ones that we had in the burrows, but they're larger. And they basically, inside of one of these loops, it's basically a giving up density experiment, if you're familiar with that. There's sand in these plates and a little bit of food in one of the plates. And she sets up multiple arrays of these walk-by readers across the landscape. And she asks whether squirrels are making decisions. So they're walking towards and they get scanned by these readers every time they approach the plate. And whether it's something about a squirrel's social interactions and these networks that predicts their order of discovery when they locate the food that's only in one of these plates. So they have errors when they're checking out other ones. But the prediction is that their social ties are predicting where they're finding food in the order of discovery. So that's sort of ongoing work that we just started up this summer. We're also with Amanda Robin at UCLA. We're tracking in an effort to start to understand more about the below ground behavior of these squirrels. We're putting on these sensors. You can see lightning bolt in this video in the middle here has a sensor collar, and we're monitoring lots of different aspects of their behavior. So there's an accelerometer on here. There's gyroscope when the squirrel spins and goes below ground. We're starting to try to monitor behavior above ground with that observed behaviors, and then train a Markov chain to try to identify behaviors that might be going on below ground. So this is also work that is ongoing and helping us try to understand what's going on in this more mysterious, otherwise hidden world that these squirrels engage in. And along those lines, I've been thinking about this with Noah and over the context of Zoom conversations and so forth. You know, our worlds have just been dramatically changed by technology. You know, I think those last couple of years, we're all on Zoom for this seminar. It has lots of opportunities for our social lives. It also could, you know, maybe trade-offs. And actually thinking about the ways that we study social behavior has dramatically changed because of the technological advances that are available. So in this paper, we reflected on, since Gene Altman 4.5 decades ago proposed this really fundamental piece of thinking about social observations in nature. We thought about the constructs that were proposed there and how technology is adding to, and maybe also some limitations of technological ideas. But importantly, the one aspect that I want to bring out is that it's allowing us to observe animals such as marine animals that are in relatively hidden spaces, animals that are below ground, and also timescales that otherwise might not be accessible. So check that out if you're interested. I put that as one of the recommended readings. And yeah, so with that, I will switch gears. That's focusing a bit more heavily on long-term studies and some of the work that I've done in the past, and more recently on squirrels. And I will then bring this to a broader context, because of course, when we think about social evolution, fundamentally, we're also interested in really broad patterns and how we can, I'm a mammalogist, so I study mammals, and how, for me, we can think about these broad patterns across a variety of different species to gain big insights into what's going on and how natural selection is favoring these things. So the work that I'm going to focus on in thinking about this comparative social evolution is leadership. And many of you are probably familiar with ideas around collective movements, and biologists have been studying collective movements where individuals move from one area to another over time. And biologists might refer to a leader as basically an individual that moves first and recruits followers that follow it. And this can give rise, particularly for groups that are fairly cohesive in group level decisions, where the leader has a disproportional influence on collective behavior of the group. And some years back now, we got together as working group, and we're thinking about this in a really big context. So we're thinking about leadership in mammalian societies, and we developed a framework for thinking about sort of 8 species that are really well understood in non-human animals, as well as 8 societal types of humans that are diverse in terms of their geographic distribution, as well as their ecologies, in an effort to try to understand broad patterns for thinking about disproportional influence on behavior. And of course, we recognized at the time that group movements, very, very important, where individuals will move from one area to another. And we focused on social animals that are in either cohesive groups, but at least everyone knows each other. So even if they're vision fusion, everyone is traveling or making decisions together to some extent. But we also recognize that these collective decisions often happen in other contexts, and often in other contexts, there's one individual that will initiate a collective behavior and others will follow. So this occurs in food acquisition as well as the distribution of resources. In mammals, non-human mammals, this tends to really mean cooperative hunting. And we see some individuals will start a hunting attempt. So in this upper panel, we've got a spotted hyena. This one is out front. It starts testing a zebra, and only with a number of group mates is it actually able to cooperatively take down this prey. And so there's some level of collective action that's occurring there. We also looked at within group conflict resolution. So in groups, the extent to which one individual is policing, stopping a fight, getting involved in a fight, or maybe in the human case, it turns out discussing and having conversations around conflict and resolving that within the group. Of course, conflict occurs not only among social members within a group, but also between members of different social groups. And this can also involve coordinated attacks. And in some species, it's really clear that one individual might often be at the front and others may join in this collective behavior. In humans, we might refer to this as warfare. We also refer to this as intergroup conflicts in non-human animals, or encounters if we're not exactly sure about the specificity there. And so basically there are all of these different ways and contexts in which individuals will interact. And some animals have more influence than others. And I wanted to, for the context of this talk and to set up where I'm going currently with this work, introduce you. There's a lot going on in this figure, so I'll try to walk you through it. There are a couple aspects of this work that I really want to bring to your attention. So the first here is that so the gray bars represent the human case and white bars represent non-human animals. And remember, there's 8 different societal types for each of these. And the orange here reflects the degree to which, so we looked at different dimensions of leadership. So there are 4 different dimensions of leadership. And this orange represents the distribution. So how distributed are leadership roles within a society? Is it consistently always the same leader that is influencing a collective decision? And these decisions occur, of course, in 4 different contexts: animals moving, foraging, within group conflict resolution, or between group, intergroup conflicts. And this distribution focuses on whether these are fairly shared to unshared decisions. And what we found was that leadership roles are less shared in conflict situations. So either conflict within the group or conflict between various groups. Who is leading, who is intervening, who is targeting aggression, that is less shared within that context than if animals are simply moving or foraging. The other part that is important to emphasize here is the relative power of these leaders. So how influential is a leader across these different contexts? And again, we found that in situations where there's conflict in these lower panels, that leaders have much more power. They behave in a certain way, and followers are much more likely to recruit and join in than if animals simply get up to move from one area to another. They may or may not recruit followers as often. So we looked at this in a lot of different ways. I just wanted to focus on that aspect and one more, which is the difference between human and non-human leaders. The degree of power that we saw differed between humans and non-humans. This is only 8 samples, so we need to obviously do more here. But the comparative analysis suggested that non-human leaders are more powerful than our human leaders in these small-scale human societies. What I've been thinking about more recently is the degree to which leadership and who's leading varies across different contexts. So here Animals can be moving. You might, in a collective movement for spotted hyenas, for example, it's usually a lactating adult female that moves first and others follow. In group hunting, it's usually a low-ranking adult male who's really limited in his access to food because females are socially dominant to males. And so across these different contexts, who's leading varies quite a bit. And I mentioned social rank, but social rank is distinct from leadership. And in the human literature, I've mapped out in this triangle to the left the definitions that people thinking about human leadership tend to use, and they tend to focus on high status individuals. Of course, when we think about this in non-human animals, it's important to distinguish between an individual that influences collective action compared to an individual that has dominance or priority of access to resources. So in this work, we basically laid out that these are distinct concepts where leadership has to do with decision-making and dominance has to do with priority of access. So for example, in non-human cases, an individual without really any dominant status, so like egalitarian lions, they do have leadership roles that they take on when they're cooperative hunting. We may also see some individuals of low status in the dominance hierarchy leading in some instances, such as in hunting, low-ranking individuals might lead, but we also have high status individuals within intergroup conflicts for spotted hyenas. So these really are separate concepts. I just wanted to raise that in case we come back to it in the discussion. And then what we've been doing most recently is thinking about two collective movement decisions across a variety of different mammals. And we're focusing on social mammals. And within social mammals, these two aspects of their behavior, either collective movement or intergroup conflict, often involves all members of the group engaging in a consensus decision. So particularly in groups where individuals are cohesive, if one individual moves to be able to increase that, maintain the social cohesion within the group, all members of the group must move together. Of course, there are exceptions to how that works. Also within the intergroup conflict, it's usually the group that has the most participants. When there's intergroup conflict, that wins. And so that's also a really important decision that often involves many members of the group joining forces to compete with another group. So we focused on these two aspects of collective decisions. And basically, we're thinking about this in terms of sex differences. So we were invited to participate in a forthcoming issue in Phil Trans on intergroup conflict. And our contribution to this work is to think about sex differences during intergroup conflict. And we started with a basic framework of thinking about mammalian biology and that the costs and benefits of an individual's willingness to participate in a collective action varies in general for males and females. So in general, males are limited by the number of mates, and females in general, because of mammalian biology through lactation and pregnancy and keeping infants safe, in general, we might expect that females are more food limited. And this gives rise to straightforward predictions about who might participate more and lead the decisions in two different contexts. And these two contexts are intergroup conflicts. So we would predict that males may be more likely to defend territories and try to go to neighboring groups to access mating opportunities and the like. Whereas in collective movements, we might instead think about the ways that females may be interested in participating in driving groups to move towards food, towards safety, and other types of situations. And we might expect a systematic sex difference. Now, these predictions come from evolutionary biology, thinking about animals. Of course, there's a parallel literature on humans. And in humans, when we think about intergroup conflict, we might call it warfare. And so Mark Van Voot and others have been thinking about gender differences in cooperation and competition. And this way of thinking is may align with the predictions of the male warrior hypothesis. The idea that a large evolutionary force in human evolution may actually be warfare, driving between group competition, and in particular males often going to war more often than females across the history of human societies. So with this in mind, we embarked on a comparative study. And this comparative study involved 79 species where we had really good information on both collective movements and also intergroup conflicts. And for this study, we focused on leadership was very clear in movements. One individual moves and the others are following it, and we call that leadership. In intergroup conflicts, it's not always as clear exactly. Some species we can tell who's initiating, who's in the front lines. In other species, the animals are up in the trees and it's happening and it's quite chaotic. So for this, we focus more on levels of participation and asked whether there is a systematic bias towards males versus females, or if species simply lacked a bias in terms of this collective behavior. And what we found is consistent with our predictions, in that these almost look like mirroring images of each other. These are controlled for evolutionary history across these different mammalian species. We see that in the collective movement context, that there's a bias towards females leading more often than males. And in the intergroup conflict, we see that males on average are leading and participating at a higher level than are females. And so we've been thinking about this in terms of females being guides, females moving members of the group, making decisions about where to forage next, where to move next as guides, maybe having information and focusing more on those safety and resources around foraging, and then males potentially as warriors. So our finding here across the social mammals that are non-human is actually consistent with the predictions that we might see in human cases from the male warrior hypothesis. And of course, I'm always interested in the exceptions to the rule. So do we ever see instances of females being warriors? And in fact, we do. So there aren't that many instances, but they're really interesting cases. And for me, throughout my career, just thinking about the exceptions to the rule actually help us to understand what are the rules generating mammalian biology. And so here we've got banded mongooses, and these females will join forces and have these intergroup conflicts, and they'll actually mate with members of other groups. So this reproductive incentive and bringing males along to be able to do that seems to be really important. We also see the female warriors are very powerful, and they often are in female-dominated societies. So spotted hyenas have females are coming to the front lines, and are often high-ranking ones are leading these charges against members of other groups. We also see this in several lemurs, but not all lemurs, and a couple of monkey and lemurs, of course, have female dominance, and then the ones that are shown here. And then we also see this in a number of two monkey species where they have polyandry. And so the females are, there are multiple females, and reproductive competition within these groups is intense. And that may give rise to females being more interested in keeping out others. And I would also say that infanticide is something that we see within these species as well. So more questions always come out of studies than we started with. And so we're trying to understand what's driving that. We're also interested in this work in thinking about bias in one context, sex bias, that is in leadership or participation, and how influence in who's leading, which sex tends to be leading more often in one context, such as collective movement, may actually predict or be correlated with that in a second context. So here you can see that the typical mammalian case is that we have female bias, both in collective movements, and male bias in intergroup conflict. That's a typical case. I'm going to show you a subset of species where we have really good coverage for that species in two contexts, the extent to which there's sex bias. And so most of them fall there. But we also see that there are cases where there's male bias or no bias in collective movements. In these instances, those species where there's no bias or males are actually leading in collective movements, we also see that males are leading in intergroup conflict. So there are no cases of females doing that. We only see cases where females are participating either equally or in those species and that we have this good coverage in these two contexts, that only in those instances where female biased collective movement is occurring, do we also see female bias in intergroup conflict. So this suggests that there may be some coevolution between these traits, and we're really interested in thinking about this further. And I guess I would just leave you, I think we're getting close to the end of the session, with some work that we're thinking about more broadly, about why there are so few women at the top of leadership positions. And we've been thinking about an evolutionary explanation for the female leadership paradox, which is, why do we have so few at the top? And this is within the mindset of thinking about industrialized societies and why there are so few women. And we've been thinking about the evolutionary history and how sexual selection can favor sex differences across mammals. And maybe that contributes to what we see in small-scale human societies and maybe group functioning and leadership by sex and gender in humans. And how an individual's life experience, whether they are encountering different social and ecological situations, institutions, and how all of these things contribute more broadly to either sex differences in non-human animals and perhaps gender differences in human civilizations as well. And of course, these factors, they can interact and they can be dynamic. And so we're thinking about this context as a way of thinking about and explaining why there might be so few women in top leadership roles. However, I would also add that thinking about the ways that females lead in our comparative framework of mammalian biology allows us to actually think about the context in which females lead, and females do lead in many different contexts, and the ways that females lead. So it might be that females are leading, but it often is underappreciated and perhaps not recognized as leadership per se. And so I'll just kind of leave you with that thought. And I will just remind you of where we've been. We've been thinking about social behavior or fitness consequences, been using long-term studies, first on hyenas, but more recently on these California ground squirrels. And then I've been thinking about these large-scale collective action problems and collective decisions about leadership within a comparative social evolution frame across mammals more generally. And maybe there's some insights that we can glean about human behavior from these perspectives. I'd like to thank all of the members of Team Squirrel. So I'm in an undergraduate-only department, and lots of work over the years to study these animals. I know some folks are on this call. Thanks for coming. I also like to thank all of the funding sources for supporting this work, and we'll open it up for questions and discussion. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Jen. That was a really fascinating talk.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it. So this is an opportunity for people to engage in discussion, ask questions. If you have a question, please post a question mark in the chat, and I will be calling on you. For those of you on YouTube, please put a question mark into the chat there. There's a bit of delay, but I will relay that to the speaker. So let's get the discussion started. It looks like our first question comes from Michael Taborski. And please, when you come in to ask a question, please introduce yourself, where you're from, so we can continue to build this community. Thank you.
Michael Taborski from University of Bern. Thank you very much for this interesting talk. What I would be interested in, you mentioned that you're interested in fitness effects, in fitness consequences, and you also outlined that there are two different concepts, leadership on the one hand and dominance on the other hand. And I would be interested in the differential fitness effects of leadership versus dominance, whether they have any data about that.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. That is a great question. So thinking about the difference between leaders and dominance per se, and that's something that we wrestled with quite a bit back in our working group. So we were thinking about resource access, or we were thinking about influence of collective behavior. In the tree paper that I referenced, that is one of the recommended readings, we talk about the relative benefit of these behaviors, and we for the extent that it's known, tried to measure this. Of course, measuring fitness consequences is incredibly challenging. Not many people have very good data on it. But we do know for, I think the species that we know about the fitness consequences of leadership per se, where an individual is differentially influencing collective behavior, if they're also dominant, we probably have the most information about the fitness consequences there. For the ones that it's much more egalitarian and less distributed, but they also have differential influence, I think measuring the fitness consequences is much more challenging. I'm involved in this project still coming. I see a couple of you on the call that are here. We're doing this large-scale reproductive skew project, and thinking about variation in reproductive consequences across mammals, humans included, looking at small-scale human societies. And maybe those data would actually allow us to connect for these different, and that's kind of what I'm hoping would be cool to think about next. If we have all of that information on reproductive outcomes, then can we actually connect that to questions around leadership, around dominance, and help to distinguish between the two? So the answer is we don't 100% know, but we'd like to know, and great question.
Yeah, apparently you are on track. I think that's important. Thank you.
Absolutely. But I mean, I guess I would just add that staying alive is very important. We know, intergroup conflicts, the outcomes, influence, territory access, and food, and all of these things certainly have fitness consequences. But measuring them, gosh, I wish we had better answers on that.
Okay, so keep putting questions in the chat, please. Question marks. The next in the queue looks like it's coming from Rag.
This is Raghavendra Gadakar from the Indian Institute of Science. Thank you. I really enjoyed this talk. I have never worked with mammals, so it's absolutely fascinating. Now, I was particularly interested in the last part of your talk where you focused on collective movement and collective decision making. Now, I work with insects, and from my point of view, the dominant paradigm in understanding collective movement and collective decisions, not only for insects, but maybe even for fish and birds, is the opposite of leadership. It's bottom-up self-organization. And you talked about a contrasting paradigm of leadership and top-down individual-based thing. So I'm trying to understand how we would try to connect these two paradigms, or try to understand how one goes from one paradigm to the other. Does it depend on the species? Does it depend on the context? Can you have the same species? Can you have both paradigms working, one at one time, another time? So I'm trying to place both these paradigms in one single frame and trying to understand the relationship between these two paradigms. I'm sure you have thought about this much more than I have.
Yeah. I think this is fascinating to think about. Okay, we might see these patterns in one set of taxa, but then how do they actually transfer to another social taxa? So I think I would make the point first that maybe in the human case, in more modern, like large-scale human societies, we might have a top leader that is dictating sort of how things are. Actually, across mammals, we see a very different pattern in general. So on average, they're more distributed in terms of their leadership, and I emphasize that there's more power when it comes to between group conflict. So there we might see a more concentrated system, similar to maybe humans going to war, maybe having that top down. But the most common form of collective behavior, and in fact, we have the most resolution of it, is that group travel. And there, it's very much who is in that role is very much distributed. It depends upon the attributes of that animal at any one given time, who's hungry, who's lactating, what are they going through at that moment. And so it's very much a trait-based approach for thinking about who's leading. And yeah, so I think, sometimes it is particular individuals, but in most cases, it's actually not. I think another really interesting comparison between the mammals and social insects is also the role of resource limitation. So at the very beginning of my talk, I mentioned how hyena social networks are, in the structure of them, it's responding to food. And actually, when food is super abundant, it reduces feeding competition for hyenas. Now, I've heard and starting to understand more in that you see the opposite pattern in social insects. And so I wonder if resource access and sort of I don't know how that fits in, or if it does. Be curious to, get any insights from that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, our next question is from Rose Holmes.
Hi, Jen. It's good to see you. My name is Rose. I'm a prospective graduate student helping support Jen in some of her work on sex-biased leadership. And Michael took my first question, so I'm going to pivot a little bit. And I was interested to hear about the cost of sociality in ground squirrels in terms of parasite and disease transmission, which I imagine is correlated with their close quarters lifestyle. I'm curious what costs of sociality exist in cooperative animals that live in less enclosed habitats, like free roaming on the plains of Kenya.
Yeah, great to see you on here, Rose. And absolutely, I think my answer would be similar to that Michael's question about, these general big patterns. Gosh, fitness is really difficult to measure. From long-term studies, we're able to measure longevity. We're still working on, I can't believe it, we have all the samples in my freezer, the pedigree for these animals to try to really distinguish. We think who mom is, but there's multiple paternity in these litters. And so who is dad, and how is grouping behavior? What are the costs and benefits associated with that? And how can we actually track those social network traits, track those individual differences with response to safety decisions onto how many offspring they're producing in a year, and also how long they live for. And that is a fundamental question that we're still out to ask. Don't yet know the answer, but working on it. There's always more questions.
All right, so we have another question in the queue. It comes from Tony DeFiore.
Hi, Tony DeFiore, Department of Anthropology at UT Austin. Jen, thank you. That was a really lovely talk. I really enjoyed listening to it. And I don't have a very well formulated question, but two things that came to mind as you were speaking. One, the definition of leadership that you're using or operationalizing is really a spatial one, right? Or at least for many of the texts, it's a spatial one. And so I was curious what you think about if you've thought about, I'm sure you have thought about other kind of things you might assay that are going to be reflective of leadership. When I think about leadership, yes, there is, leading, there's almost inherent in that term is a spatial kind of component to it. And yet we think of politicians, deans, whatever, as leading in a somewhat different way. And so I thought, I was curious what other dimensions or characteristics you might use to define leadership. And then kind of a second and related to maybe the first part of your talk, to what extent these individual characteristics and consistency across context, personality may correlate with leadership as you've defined it, or as you might alternatively define it in a non-spatial way. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. Those are really great questions. So So I think the first one is about how do we define leadership and how do we think about it behaviorally. And of course, when we're observing these animals, we often do track movements. So how that's happening over space and time using sort of a metaphysics approach. So we can't interview the non-human animals, what are you thinking about this? But we can track who they are and the decisions that they make. So we've also thought about, and I didn't really emphasize it here because it's not as large of a scale problem, but there's conflict within the group. And that's often segregated out by sex. So usually we have coalitions that are forming with members of the same sex, particularly for adults. And we've looked at and thought about how over that smaller scale problem, how some individuals are resolving or influencing the outcome of fights within the group. And that has some implications for thinking about the second part of your question, which is about that department chair or administrator or whatever, settling conflicts within an institution. For non-humans, it's usually on a much smaller number of animals within a group is smaller. But for humans at a university, I can imagine at UT Austin, it's probably a large number of individuals that are being directed in some way. And so are there attributes relating to the personality of individuals? Absolutely. And we've thought about this. This is work with Mark Van Boot, thinking about this with human and non-humans together. And we've basically distinguished two styles of leadership. And these styles of leadership can be prestige-based. So a leader may actually attract followers, and this isn't just necessarily in a movement way, but in behaving and shifting the group's behavior because of something that is good or individuals are interested in pleasing, if you will, or they're gaining some benefit from that prestige style leader. The other category of leaders are these more dominant style, that dominant male, and I'm thinking of I'm coming from the States, I'm apologetic of our previous president, that style of leadership, if you call it leadership, I don't know. But that style of being feared, I'm always right, I'm always doing things of a certain way. We do see that in non-human mammals as well. And so, I think there's interesting parallels in separating out those styles. And then within those styles, some individual traits map more onto that. And I would also say that context matters too. What type of leadership style tends to emerge. So if animals are simply moving from one area to another, or they're foraging, it might be more kind of prestige-based, who's moving first, whereas dominance might be more important in a situation where there's direct conflict, where animals could actually potentially die. And so that more strict hierarchy and less sharing of who potentially is leading could be more important in that context. I hope that gets at some of your questions. Thank you.
Okay, our next question comes from Kaya Tombach.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I'm Kaya Tombach, postdoc with Jessica Rothman at Hunter College. And I was interested in the exceptions that you found to those female guides and male warriors. So you listed some for, the exceptions to the male warriors being the female warriors. And I didn't see too much of a pattern there necessarily, but did you see a pattern of the direction and or presence of sexual dimorphism in the male guides? and could you list some of those exceptions as well? I'd be interested in hearing.
Yes. Thank you so much for that question. I didn't have time to talk about that, so I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to discuss the implications of sexual dimorphism and also resource defense with respect to these patterns, sex differences and collective behavior. And actually, we tested for both of those aspects in the comparative model, and we did not see any evidence of sexual dimorphism predicting sex bias in either of the contexts. We expected to, But once we, looked across all of the species and brought in some species that have a reduction in sexual dimorphism, others that have a great sexual dimorphism, it's really interesting. I mean, I think it almost is philosophical, that finding, in that we tend to focus on, in our teaching and sometimes in our examples, really sexual dimorphic species, maybe in one case. So we might think about gorillas. I did that even to introduce the context of thinking about sex differences. And they're often, chimpanzees and gorillas get a lot of attention thinking about these intergroup conflicts. But they're only one species. So the comparative structure is really powerful because it allows us to think about general rules across mammals overall. And we did see, I also thought we might see sexual dimorphism because in spotted hyenas, of course, the females are slightly larger than males, but they're fairly similarly sized. It takes about 70 hyenas, I think, in order to determine that sex difference in size. And also lemurs that are breaking this rule, we see a reduction in sexual dimorphism as well. And so I guess I was somewhat surprised that we didn't see that, but I also think it's really interesting. And the second part we looked at was resource defense, thinking about the food that animals are focused on. And this was more to get at thinking about females and their decisions, maybe around limited access to food. And we also did not have that come out in the model as being important. So great questions. I think next steps are to think about infanticide, and that seemed to be one that appeared in some of these cases that were deviations from the rule. And yeah, so thanks for that question.
Thank you.
All right, so still seeking more questions. If you have one, please post in the question mark in the chat. In the meantime, we have a question from YouTube, so I'm going to read it from the other screen. This comes from Pedro Diaz at the Universidad Veracruzana in Mexico. He says, great talk. And he said, would your definition of leadership be compatible with that of leverage, meaning power based upon a resource that cannot be taken by force? In this sense, could leadership be understood as a particular realm of leverage?
Wow, Pedro. I think I have not dwelled on that question in particular, but I do know that from thinking about this, that we've thought about like how powerful, how much influence an individual has in these different contexts, and that is a part of leadership. Leverage, I tend to think of within the context of dominance more so, but if it's not taken by force, how does that link into here? And I think that would map more onto leadership. So I guess I'm not 100% sure in my thinking. I would want to take some time to think about exactly how that is. But what I would say is that across mammals, when we look at these patterns of leadership, most of it is not forced. So we're especially in the prestige-based systems, but even in the ones I alluded to, this dominant style leader that we see in human societies, but also in some of the non-human ones, what's happening is there's usually more subtle recruitment. It's more communication is actually recruiting leaders, recruiting followers to join in this collective behavior. And we very rarely see coercion. And so, I looked at that in an earlier paper. I was looking at hyena leadership and movements, and I just did a quick review of what we saw in the literature and Animal Behavior 2015. And basically there we saw that there's all this communication that's going on within the group oftentimes, but sometimes it's just an animal gets up and and others follow. So yeah, I don't know. Those are some thoughts that I have initially. I would love to, if there, this is more conversation based, if folks in the audience have thoughts about the relationship between leverage and dominance versus leadership and all these things. I'd love for folks to chime in.
Yeah, certainly. If you want to chime in, just throw a question mark. We'll do it that way because I do have one in the queue, but I'd love to have some follow up, and also for folks on YouTube, I'll keep an eye on that. Pedro, if you have a follow up question or comment, please relay that. I'll relay that to the speaker if you post it in the chat over there. I'm going to go to our next question. It's from Annalise Beery.
Hi, Annalise Beery. I guess I wanted to sort of zoom in a little bit back to your squirrels. I was really curious when you were starting to look at the social networks. I love this idea of there's this above ground world and the below ground world, and it's really neat that you have the data to correlate the behavior above ground and underground and say that those relationships are similar. But I was really surprised to some extent, I guess. I think the standards for social interaction above ground, or the bar would be much lower, right, for the sort of collective predator avoidance or sort of monitoring when you're feeding, than below ground when you're actually sharing a burrow. And I think of that as sort of the, how social are they? Are they willing to burrow share together? And then I saw, this is getting long-winded, I saw in your picture that your social group looked like a mother with its offspring, and that a lot of those animals in your social network diagrams were juveniles. And so I guess I'm just curious, in your ground squirrels, how much of that below ground sort of more intense social behavior is really just family groups with undispersed offspring, and to what extent do you see it, among adult conspecifics?
Yeah, thank you for returning back to the squirrel work and helping me to think about that. So let's see, the first question is sort of what are the nature of the social interactions and how are they interacting above ground? And, there we were looking at being in really close proximity, so less than a meter, often sitting in body contact or exchanging a nose-to-nose greet, and things like that often reflect a social choice to interact directly with another animal. Below ground, we really were limited, and this is where we are currently with the work, to association. So these are association networks, the above ground are interaction networks, right? So there's a distinction between the types of behaviors, and work with Amanda, what inspired putting these collars and these sensors, it's really challenging actually, but super fun, is to actually figure out, okay, what are they doing below ground? And can we actually detect similar suites of behavior below ground compared to what we're doing above ground? So it's almost remarkable in a way that the below ground and above ground did correlate quite heavily. And it does suggest that there is some structure that's there. Obviously, family groupings is very important. So we do see differences in terms of juveniles and adults, and in particular, adult females in the below ground context have a very high centrality. So females indirectly connect probably members of their matriline in these shared burrows. And so I do think there's some structure there that once we get that pedigree built, we can start to explain social networks and see to what extent is it offspring and mother together. But we also, I guess anecdotally, I could say at this point that in the networks, everyone, even below ground, was connected either directly or indirectly. So we had a couple of stations, and I didn't get to talk about the layout. This is spatial. And the stations and the areas where these burrows are located are quite far apart. And we did have visits even in the burrows of adult females that were not part of the family group. So that is why we, for the network approach, put the entire group together, because we were interested in those weak connections as well as the close ones, which obviously within the family group was going to be really, really important. The second part of your question, or maybe it was more about the family grouping. You want to chime in again?
Yeah, no, I think you answered it. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. It's like Zulema.
I have a question that's in the chat. It comes from Monique Bergerhoff Mulder. She's in a car. She's not driving though. And she said she wants to relay the question: did you talk about the cost of leadership in social mammals? And she says, clearly, obviously, an intergroup conflict, but what about other domains? How that might affect both the distribution of leadership and indeed sex differences in leadership?
Yeah, thanks, Monique. Of course, Monique has been instrumental in the working group and helped us to really think about these foundational ways of mapping leadership across different mammalian societies. One thing that we wrestled with in that context is these service leaders. So an idea is that, is an individual actually paying a cost for being a leader? And as you mentioned, clearly, if the individual is at the front line of an intergroup conflict, those can be lethal, right? And so individual differences in terms of either sexes and age of individuals and they're participating, their interests can often predict who's going to be in the front lines if we know it. But also we do see costs and benefits in other contexts. And so, yeah, I think that that's a really interesting question. Lauren, I'm sorry, or I guess I could look in I lost track of part of the second.
You want me to read it again?
Oh, the distribution and sex differences. I was thinking of Monique in her car, got distracted. Yeah, and so, the sex differences, absolutely, I think that could drive access to, so the extent to which collective behaviors do have consequences for resource acquisition, that can be really important. And thinking about outside of intergroup conflict, just simply moving from one area to another. A lot of even humans, we do this, hopefully. Maybe in the pandemic, we've been more sedentary, but we make decisions every day about where to go, when to go, what to do when we're there. And it's all about time allocation. And so there are trade-offs. If one individual is busy going off on their own and initiating a movement, it might actually be out of self-interest. So we do see evidence of that. They're hungry. Zebra, for example, one of the first studies that I became aware of is from Zebra on leadership. And it's the lactating females that are initiating leadership and going to watering holes. And, that started us to think about the roles of females in collective behavior and within this context of movement. And lo and behold, we started to see lots of evidence for females doing this first. And now the comparative analysis controlling for the phylogenetic signal confirms the pattern that we were starting to see there. So yeah, it does seem like there are differences based on the attributes of the individuals that are involved. And sometimes there's a cost, but often we see that these are motivational based on the state, the attributes of the individual that is engaged in the leadership. Yeah, cool.
Great. So the next question is from Zulema.
Yeah. Hi, Jen. Zulema Tang Martinez from the University of Missouri in St. Louis, retired. My question also goes back to your ground squirrel part of your talk. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the difference in the way that the networks respond to dogs versus coyotes and humans. And I'm assuming that this must be a learned response. And I'm wondering whether in your ground squirrels, you have humans ever coming in and shooting up the ground squirrels. I know that in prairie dogs, that's quite common where people for sport will come in and shoot them and kill them. And also whether in the case of dogs, you have ever seen bigger dogs who go into the colonies and kill ground squirrels. And so I'm wondering if any of those experiences of being killed occur in the ground squirrels, and whether you think that may be behind the two different reactions to dogs and coyotes. And if not, then what you think is going on and why they respond so differently, particularly to dogs and coyotes, but also to humans. Thanks.
Great to see you, Zulema, as always. And excellent questions. I guess I will take them in reverse. And so we absolutely do see dogs directly killing our squirrels. And actually, that is the form of predation that we have witnessed most often. So of course, birds of prey and coyotes do take them, but when we're out during the daylight hours, of course, this for folks that study activity patterns over time, there's a large number of hours when coyotes would be present that we are not always out there for. And we actually, as an aside, we are setting up, we have acoustic monitors, and we also have camera traps to monitor activity patterns outside of our periods that we're there. So we're typically there during most of the mornings observing, and sometimes into the early afternoon. And during those periods, we do see dogs taking squirrels. Not very often, but it does happen. And from our observations, more generally, we do see absolutely alarm calls in response to dogs and in response to coyotes. With respect to humans in the area, we studied them in a park. And it took me a little while when I moved to the Bay Area to figure out where I wanted to study these squirrels, because California ground squirrels are thought of as a pest species, right? And so they are controlled, and their populations are influenced by humans in most places. But at Briones, they've never had any human control issues implemented. So what we see there is fundamentally sort of natural variation in fitness consequences, hopefully. But that said, so there's not systematic controls. People don't go out and shoot them. They're not allowed to poison them. There are two types of people that visit the park. There are either people, oh gosh, you're trapping these squirrels. Are you hurting them? And no, we release them and all of that. And then the other type of person is, gosh, I hope you're getting rid of all of those squirrels. Please take them away. But they are native to California. They're ecosystem engineers. They provide a number of services through creating these burrows, and also are eaten by a lot of species, which brings you to the coyote versus human comparison with respect to Chinese networks. And we were surprised at first to see differences between responses to dogs and responses to coyotes. So to remind folks of what we see is that in general, the social network, in these 10-minute periods, we study a social network for 10 minutes, there's a disturbance for roughly a minute, and then we monitor the changes in behavior for those same individuals after a disturbance. And what we found was when humans or dogs on or off leash come through, it actually disrupts the social network so that there's a reduction in the number of those affiliative interactions. Whereas for coyotes, they actually engage in more, in particular, these greeting behaviors, nose to nose, and social proximity. So I think in relation to those differences, we were expecting dogs and coyotes to be remarkably similar. They were different in the responses. What we've been finding, and we can get some insights from the stress physiology of these animals. What we're finding is that there's a spatial component to risk sensitivity in the population. And so there's one area that's closer to an outhouse where people come by, they might water their dogs, there's a water fountain. There's more exposure to dogs and humans on that side of the population compared to the other side. And the individuals that are closer to that high human activity side are bolder in general, right? So there is some learning component, which you asked about. But their physiological response is actually elevated. So they have a higher, on average, glucocorticoid metabolite. Their stress response is they have a higher baseline compared to the ones farther away. So that suggests that there is, that the interactions with humans and dogs, and actually in the statistical model for the stress hormones, the effect of dog and the effect of human are so tightly correlated. We look at them in different ways, but they actually are like almost a one-to-one. So it seems that there's usually a human around, even if the dog is running off leash. If a dog is on leash, there's probably a human with it. And the animals that experience those situations view them as fairly similar. And the squirrels tend to disperse. They move when people come through. And so we're only looking in these networks at their above ground interactions. So that ties into some of these other questions around what are they doing above ground compared to what are they doing below ground. And With the coyotes, they actually tend to stay in a place. And so if you think about your stereotypical ground squirrel behavior, it might be them rearing up and alarm calling and being more cohesive. So we actually see the squirrels huddling more. They will alert one another through these alarm calls, through their vocalizations. And the coyotes are a bit more cryptic and are often noticed at a colony level, whereas the dogs tend to be a lot more localized. So to your question about the size of the dogs, there are individual differences in the dog's behavior. We've thought about tracking that because of course we do have some repeats. We haven't gone there yet, but there are responses to different, it's not actually the size of the dog, but the dog's behavior. So some big dogs will go right into stick their nose into the burrow and they can't usually get the squirrel once they're in, but they'll chase them. Some small dogs also do that. But there are individual differences in personalities of the dogs that probably contribute to these patterns as well. Yeah.
And I would assume that the dogs and the coyotes also behave differently. I mean, my experience with dogs chasing small mammals is that they go in like crazy, and they're dashing around and trying to catch the animal. And just from my prairie dog work, when we saw coyotes, we tended to see them sort of at the periphery and being much more stealthful rather than just, running in. And so I'm wondering if that also could influence. It sounds like it would influence the way that the ground squirrels respond.
Absolutely. That's an excellent point. Just thinking about, dogs coming from a wolf tradition and the way that they would hunt, cursorial hunting compared to stealth hunting that you might see in a coyote. Of course, if people are out, then the coyotes are much more cryptic and they do tend to stay around the peripheral area of the population that we study. So the squirrels usually tell us that a coyote is there before we see them, right? So now with the acoustic monitors and the camera traps we're detecting, there are lots of carnivores that come through the area. So that's super cool. But it tends to switch. When we leave, that's when they start to show up. And we're there when the squirrels are most active. And so, it's not necessarily that we're pushing them to anyway, so definitely there are shifts in time of day. There are different hunting styles, and that could cause differences in the short-term shifts in social behavior that we detect in the networks. Absolutely. Dogs are all over the place. Coyotes are stealth. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, really interesting talk, Jen. And I made it back just in time. So thanks.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm always glad to see.
People have a question, you can post in the question mark in the chat. Otherwise, I think I'll wait a minute just so if anyone has a question or a comment or thought they want to discuss related to the talk. I think I'm holding back on questions, Jen, for our individual meetings, so I want to let others. We got something coming from Eduardo.
Thank you, Jen, for a wonderful presentation. Made me think of the many talks that I heard from my former professor Don Owens. That's through him was that I first learned about ground squirrels and the rattlesnakes, and yeah, very interesting. But thanks. So it's refreshing. It's very, very, very exciting. I was wondering if you could please, since we have time now, get into some more detail of how you guys are thinking about abundance. In that, I think it was one of the first findings that you described, the relationship between abundance and the extent of social interactions in hyenas through the year. So I'm curious, a little bit along the lines of what Tony was asking, definitions, what do we mean by leadership? Abundance is this huge construct and we all struggle. So what does it really mean, the way you are defining it, the way you're measuring it? I'm trying to think about other ways, because my first reaction would have been that if there is less energy available per capita, I would imagine animals spreading out. Anyway, I'll let you, can you comment a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so absolutely. I guess that your final bit about so definitions, I'll start with those because those are always good, and that will help us to think about the rest of the data and the findings that we have. So in the Masai Mara, there are ungulates that are residents, so they stay there year round. And then there's this great migration of wildebeest and zebra that join the resident ungulates. So when the migrations come through, there's a superabundance, there's a large number of prey within the territory. So spotted hyenas defend, at least in the Mara, they're very stable. They have a very stable territory, and the boundaries of that territory are very much set. There's a high density of spotted hyenas, so there aren't very many options to leave. And in particular, we know when the males disperse, they go to the bottom of the dominance hierarchy. They've got to do that for mating. But if the females try to venture out of that territory, they are attacked very much so by members of the neighboring social group. So there's a set. So I feel like, I went into this talk trying to think about social behavior. I'm coming out of it now thinking that space is so important to all of these aspects. So I love that question I had earlier about spatial aspects. And for a spotted hyena, there's a set amount of space that prey can occupy. So sometimes, some months of the year, in that space, that their territorial space, it has a large number of prey. Other times it has very few prey. It's all, there's a fair amount of prey most of the year, but relatively speaking, and that's how we defined it. So during that 3-month period in the migration, there's a lot of food. And what we see during that migration is that the social connections, how often individuals associate within the network. So they're in fission fusion societies, they can spend time away, they can come back together. So they make active decisions about who they're going to associate with and for how long and so forth. So the network shows that as there's more food, and the mechanism we think that's going on is there's a reduction in feeding competition. And we know that from other data looking at variation in dyadic fights. So how often are animals fighting? There's a reduction in fighting within the group at that interaction level. And then at the network association level, they're more likely to spend time together when there's a lot of food. Is that working definition wise?
Yes, I'm just trying to, because
Yeah.
all of us struggle with how we're going to make progress in kind of zoning into more narrowly defined possible factors that may be related to what we're interested in. And I use a lot of when I'm teaching, I bring the supermarket analogy a lot. And what I was trying to get at is, so let's say that I'm looking at what kind of prey or what kind of food is available at the supermarket as a whole through the month. But the truth is that people should not be just counting the number of food items that are on the shelves, because through the month, I may walk into the store, but at the end of the month, I simply cannot afford the expensive items. So suddenly, are you guys just counting number of ungulates? But a lot about that would be a very crude measure of food available, since most likely, at least from what we see in the documentaries, it's always the poor halves, the weak, or the elderly. So is there room for again, you're trying to zone in understanding, you did talk about this, that of course we're trying to understand what are the things that the specifics. So is it possible that there are more precise measures of what is really available food?
Yeah, absolutely.
The animals than just counting number of ungulates.
Absolutely. So as part of those prey censuses, so we go out, we drive with the vehicle, and we count up what's there. We get which species are there, whether they're young, whether they're adults. Of course, if there's a lot of young ungulates, those are easier to access. So that's an important part of the story as well. We've looked at, and this is part of my earlier work on fission fusion dynamics, also the number of animals that show up at a particular prey item. So for example, when we often, so hunting is amazing to see. We love to see it. It's really interesting. We like to think about that cooperative behavior. most of what we see, even though spotted hyenas are hunting the majority of their own prey, is animals already feeding on something. And so in that situation, we can, again, it's counting, I know, numbers, it's kind of a rough, coarse way of thinking about it, but we count the number of hyenas that are feeding on a prey item of a various size. And what we see is if there's a large prey item, so a giraffe, it might be they didn't necessarily hunt it themselves, or an elephant that's a carcass that they don't directly hunt that. But when there's a large prey item, it relaxes feeding competition, more mouths can eat on it. And we have a really nice correlation between the number of hyenas eating and the size of the prey. Whereas if it's a small Thompson's gazelle or something like that, not a lot to share. So we usually only have a solitary animal that's feeding on it. For those instances that we're lucky enough to actually witness the entire sequence of hunting behavior, we also see that there's sort of this cost-benefit analysis of hunting together versus alone. And most hyenas actually hunt by themselves. And the reason for that is once they hunt together, even in a pair, they're noisy, and the feeding competition sets in as soon as that food is captured, and they'll start engaging in dyadic interactions that are often loud, and that recruits followers, or not followers, thinking about leadership, that recruits competitors to show up at that kill. And so then we can measure over time how much of that particular food item, and we can use measures from physiology to actually correspond food on the table, if you will, to the amount of meat and calorie consumption for a given individual per capita. If there's two feeding, what do they get? There's one feeding, and track that over time. And it turns out that unless you're a really high-ranking adult female, most times, it's better to hunt by yourself, because that feeding competition just is so intense that, So those are some general thoughts about the way we can collect the data. We get what we can, and these long-term studies, I would just say, are incredibly valuable, because they often will capture these relatively infrequent events. But if we get enough of them, we could start to learn about the patterns and try to think about what's going on.
Thank you. That helps. That helps understand the richness in the details of how you can try to get at that competition. Thank you.
Yeah. And since I've left the hyena lab too, there have been a lot more detailed analyses. So Amiel, I could send you his paper. We can talk about it later. Has done some really, every month, like how that looks, the exact number of prey and so forth. So we do have absolutely a lot more detail there we can get into.
All right, so I think we have one final question, and then we'll give you a bit of a break, Jen. It comes
Great.
from Angela Amaro.
Hi, I was wondering if it kind of relates to the coyotes and the dogs to squirrels. Have you experienced squirrels using humans to deter hawks when they are nearby?
Yeah, good to see you, Angela. Thanks for the great question. This again, speaking to the rarity of the types of occurrences, we don't see a lot of direct predation attempts by hawks on the squirrels. Of course, they do it, and they are successful, and we do see them favoring particular trees that are above where the squirrels are in residence, and particularly when they're young squirrels that are there. And we do have information on, so again, space is very important, and for the squirrels, it's even more important than hyenas. Each squirrel has a burrow that it's pretty faithful to, and they travel, of course, around, but we can, through our observations, each burrow has a name, or burrow complex. The trees have a name, so we can actually keep track of, over time, how many hawks are there, how many humans are there, what the squirrels are doing. So we've not looked at those indirect associations. I think you're suggesting maybe a mutualistic interaction between humans and birds of prey. We've not looked at that, but perhaps we could. So yeah, very interesting question. I definitely think from the data that we just started collecting about a year ago. So I think we're about 2 years in from these camera traps and the acoustic monitors of what's going on when humans are there and what's going on when humans are not there, and thinking about it really across a 24-hour cycle. And also, because it's a public park, there are humans that visit often, less often on the weekdays, and that's when we are typically there as observers. But on the weekends, the reason we don't go out on the weekends is, people have parties nearby and it's just a completely different situation. But we're really interested in uncovering, what does that mean for the lives of the squirrels? What does that mean for their predators? I didn't get to talk about today some work that Chelsea Ortiz is also doing, who's doing her PhD at the NDC at UC Davis and working on Team Squirrel, with giving up densities. So, Aaron, who's here, is looking at these small scale decisions with a small number of plates of sand with a little bit of seed in one of them. What Chelsea has done, and folks got to go, but thanks for listening and coming. She's put out over 100 of these plates across the entire area where humans are, and she looks at the giving up density on a spatial scale, and she's actually finding that there is sort of a human-induced landscape of fear. So basically, there's a correlation between how many human visits we have and how many risk-sensitive behaviors the squirrels will engage in. And it's really interesting, the patterns are sort of disrupted during COVID when we had very few humans in the park. So we have a lens of what was going on before, where the squirrels that are in areas where there's high human activity across the summer, when we run this large scale experiment, we put out 100 plates and we observe where they are willing to eat the most food. They're willing to actually eat more and stay longer foraging at those areas closer to humans. So even though in the networks, we're finding that a human walking through can disrupt that social cohesion in a short term, there's on average this sort of beneficial aspect probably of humans being there, and it's probably related to the natural predators and how often they're there. Great question. Yeah.
Well, wow, that was quite fascinating, Jen. Thank you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the Zoom here on the YouTube, and then you have an opportunity to sit and chat for a couple minutes with other folks who want to stay around. But I just want to officially thank you. That was really a great talk and discussion. Another really fine series seminar, and I really appreciate you being here today.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. And thank you for all the great questions. Keep them coming. And my contact information is there. So please reach out. I always love more feedback. And I have way more data with these undergrads than we know what to do with. So anyone looking for data, please reach out as well.